Everybody, this is Chris Childers. I am a first-year grad student at Alabama. This is my first semester, and I happen to take the history of journalism class with Dr. Bragg, which was a little bit of a challenge out of the gates, but I would say I'm pretty excited that I did it because I really enjoyed taking on the research paper and learning about the history of media this year. But my presentation is about this really cool paper that I was able to dig into, and I named it the NCAA Greed versus the Free Market. Now, this is all about a scandal that happened in 2010. If you go back, Ohio State had a crazy end of the season. They were having a wonderful season. Jim Tressel was their coach. He had won a national championship, revered coach, well thought of. People called him the senator and the sweater vest. And he was really he was one of those buttoned up, admired guys by most people in college football. Well, that changed right before the Sugar Bowl in 2010. There was this huge scandal. People called it Tattoo-gate. And it essentially led to the suspension of 5 Ohio State football players, including quarterback Terrell Pryor, and eventually Jim Tressel resigned as the head football coach. So this was a wild scandal. It was covered really extensively by most of the national media, including myself. I'm a SiriusXM college sports radio host, which is why I chose this topic, because this is something that I covered. It's near and dear to me. And I really wanted to dig into really the tenor and the sentiment of what was going on with the media back then and kind of juxtapose it to now, because there's been major changes over the last couple of years in college sports. So that's what this is all about. It's all about Ohio State. It's all about 2010 and how the world of college athletics has evolved. And you sort of look back at the sentiments and some of the things that were written about and talked about from the media when it came to Ohio State. It seems very dated, even though it was just over a decade ago, considering all that has changed in the world. So this is about Tattoo-gate. It's about Ohio State. The reason I feel it's important, the world is flipped on its head. And it's kind of wild to go back and look at all the things that were written about some of the scandals that had to deal with the NCAA. Now, when it comes to this Terrell Pryor scandal, there were no laws broken. And I think that's really important that everybody understand. No actual local law or federal law or state law or nothing was broken. This was just against NCAA rules. Now, what's interesting is that nowadays we have a free market. We have name, image, and likeness. It's the wild, wild west. Anybody can make money pretty much off of anything. There's no legislation whatsoever. And that's the world that we live in right now. Well, back then, that's not what we had. So what was interesting, I wanted to see how the media treated this. How did they treat these players? How did they treat why did they try to make money? What was going on in their lives at the time when it came to the Ohio State players and their families and all that kind of stuff? And I was curious if the media was sympathetic with them, if they were just rule enforcers. Were they doing the NCAA's bidding, essentially? So that was the whole point of what I wanted to take on. I thought it was super important, especially in light of the NCAA versus Alston case that really opened up a free market, and that happened in June of 2021. So that was the main focus there. And I'm really glad I chose it, because there's a lot of people that I work with. Now I'm a SiriusXM radio host, like I said, that I work with, that I, have on my radio show, that I go back and I listen to some of their sentiments back in 2010 and kind of juxtapose it to what they're saying now about very similar circumstances is kind of wild. I mean, it really is kind of night and day how things have shifted. So I thought it was important. What I looked at in my research, what I looked for in my research, I just wanted to hear what people were saying. What did they think about Terrell Pryor? Terrell Pryor, for those that don't know the basis of the story, these were young men. It was 5 Ohio State players that essentially, it was a tough time in the economy. Their families needed money. So they said, hey, we're celebrities. We can sign autographs. If somebody's willing to pay for our autographs, great. So that's what they did. They also had these little trinkets that they would give out to Ohio State players when they beat Michigan, little gold pants. and somebody wanted to buy them for a decent amount of money. They belonged to the players. No laws were broken whatsoever. I could do it. You could do it. They did it. They gave money back to mom and dad, and essentially got caught doing this, and a huge scandal became of it because it broke NCAA rules. So I went back and I looked at some of the things that were written about what was going on, and I really wanted to dig into not only the national media, but the local media, the Ohio media, radio, television, all these different varieties of things that are out there. Because remember, back then, this was 2010, so we were at that point where a lot of different college football media were starting to pop up. A lot of .coms, a lot of blogs, a lot of different things that were out there, and this was a heavily, and I mean heavily covered scandal. So I really wanted to dive into a lot of, different areas to see what was the sentiment. Did people understand why the kids did what they did? Or was this mostly just a negative take? A negative take on what was going on? Because nowadays, everybody understands. It's commonplace. The kids they're making commercials. They're wearing Louis Vuitton chains and all kinds of different things. But back then, just 13 years ago, things were pretty different. So I wanted to look into a lot of what the sentiments were back then and kind of compare them to where things are now. What I found in the material was a lot of negativity. In fact, I'll read to you some of the things that were said. Pat Forty is a very, very famous writer. He's written for Yahoo. He's written for ESPN. It's kind of amazing when you look back to some of the things that he said back then about what was going on. And here's what he said about Terrell Pryor, because again, these were items that these kids own, these little trinkets and the autographs. And Forty essentially made the argument that, college football is so sacred. I'll read to you, quote, "If they had a full appreciation of what it means to play for Ohio State and to play in a bowl and to be a part of tradition much larger than themselves, they wouldn't have sold what they sold. The championship rings would mean too much. So would the gold pants, which are small jewelry awards given to every Buckeye for beating Michigan," end quote. So Forty was a guy that really went, and he went on and on many times throughout the coming months after that, after the Sugar Bowl, which was a highly controversial game that the players actually did play in before getting suspended. But he went on and on. Andrew Sharp of SB Nation said, quote, "From the second he heard about this idiotic mistake, Jim Tressel, did everything he could to contain the angle from every situation with the tipster, with Pryor, and even the FBI agent. The Denver Post really took it to Jim Tressel and Ohio State. He argued that Pryor's blame is twofold, suggesting that the quarterback cheated a little bit more because he had $40,000 worth of gifts, which is more than anybody else on the team." So there was a lot of things kind of being said. Bill Dwyer called Coach Tressel smarmy. The pressure kept mounting to the point where eventually Terrell Pryor left Ohio State a year early, and the NFL upheld his suspension, which was crazy for 5 games in hindsight, and a lot of people have written about that. And Jim Tressel resigned because the pressure just got too big. What's interesting, though, no laws were broken at all here, and the players were trying to help their families, and yet the backlash was what it was. The media was pretty negative. In fact, one of the players' mothers, I found this quote fascinating. DeVere Posey's mom. So he was one of the suspended players that made this comment, quote, "They didn't do anything that any other player wouldn't have done. They looked around to see what they could do to help their families. There's no crime. None. They're not involved with agents. They didn't steal anything. They didn't borrow anything from anybody. It was theirs. Nobody told them it almost belonged to you. It belonged to them," end quote. So, meanwhile, the coverage was extremely negative. There was a lot of awful stuff going on. Tressel has to resign. I mean, it's kind of wild. Then you fast forward to 2021. The Alston case happens, which essentially, in a nutshell, I'll just tell you quickly, it ruins the concept of amateurism. It goes back to 1984. The NCAA had an ability to really kind of not have to follow the Sherman Antitrust Act. They could do essentially whatever they wanted to do in the name of amateurism, in the name of the purity of the product. That was shot down in 2021. And the Supreme Court, now think about it, this current group is super divided, right? 9-0. They went against an NCAA that spent $75 million in legal fees to maintain amateurism. And I get why, because they had a lot to lose. But listen to what Brett Kavanaugh, Supreme Court Justice, had to say about the NCAA. And again, the media was doing a lot of the bidding, what I found in my research. But listen to this, quote, all the restaurants in a region cannot come together to cut cooks' wages on the theory that customers prefer to eat food from low-paid cooks. Law firms cannot conspire to cabin lawyers' salaries in the name of providing legal services out of a love of the law. Hospitals cannot agree to cap nurses' income in order to create a purer form of helping the sick. And news organizations cannot join forces to curtail pay to reporters to preserve a tradition of public-minded journalism. Movie studios cannot collude to slash benefits to camera crews to kindle a spirit of amateurism in Hollywood. You get where they were saying. So they completely, and that's end quote. Brett Kavanaugh crushed the NCAA, and essentially everything's changed since. And now we have players like Angel Reese, who I talked to at SEC Media Days, who I quoted in this paper that's talked about how NIL is a blessing. She can help her parents. She can send money back to mom. She doesn't have to borrow anything. She can be a celebrity because she earned it. Her talents certainly have put her in that category. So fascinating research. Really interesting to see what the tones were of the media back then in 2010, as opposed to where we're at now, where everybody kind of accepts the world of NIL. So thanks for your attention, and happy holidays to everybody.